I love technology and I hate it.
Well said.
So let's just see if Stephen got in, and then we'll get started.
All right, I think I'm in.
Are you in, Stephen?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right, can you see me?
Let me see you.
I can see him.
All right, we can see you, Stephen. Awesome. All right, so I'm going to kick this over to Susan.
Hi, everybody. It's so cool that there's so many of you here today. My name is Susan. I'm a senior at George School in Newtown, Pennsylvania. Just for some brief housekeeping, all of your audio is off for right now, but if you'd like to ask a question later, if you'd like to ask a question to Stephen yourself, just put an asterisk next to your name, and please include where you're from as well as your name, and you can ask him yourself. After we address the questions sent in with registration, we'll call on you folks to ask your individual questions or maybe share a reflection or a thought that you had about your own activism. Students, if you could send your answers to the 3 questions in the chat to the Speak Truth to Power, the final session will directly address your issues and how you are taking action. The 3 questions are: what issues do you most care about? What change would you like to see on that issue? And how have you or would you like to take action? And you can send your responses to sttp@rfkhumanrights.org. Okay, now that all that's out of the way. Welcome to the first event in the Speak Truth to Power Human Rights Defender Speaker Series. Speak Truth to Power is the human rights education program of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights was founded soon after Robert Kennedy was assassinated. The organization was founded by families and friends to carry on his unfinished business addressing civil rights, farm workers' rights, social justice, and human rights. A core strategic area of RFK Human Rights is that everyone is a human rights defender. Over the course of this speaker series, we hope students and educators alike gain a new and perhaps greater insight into how we can protect, promote, and defend human rights. Today, I'm very excited to introduce Stephen Bradberry. Stephen received the RFK Human Rights Award in 2005 for his work as a community organizer in Louisiana, where he helped to empower grassroots networks in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and ultimately shaped the city's planning process, even turning the lower Ninth Ward a pilot program for the rebuilding process. Currently, Bradbury is the executive director of the Alliance Institute, which provides community organized trainings to nonprofits and community-based organizations in New Orleans. Thank you, Stephen.
All right. So I just jump in, is that what it is?
Totally, take it away.
Not really sure where to begin. Yeah, so in 2005, as it was mentioned, I did win the award. I would like to point out that while it did occur in 2005 and the receipt of the award occurred just after Hurricane Katrina, it's important to note that I had been nominated prior to the hurricane happening, and that it wasn't just a matter of the hurricane response. Prior to that, I had done significant work in the areas of lead poison prevention, which a lot of you all are familiar through what has happened in Flint, Michigan. But even before that, as early as 2000, we had designed some programs and were working locally in New Orleans and nationally on lead poisoning prevention. Also on voter engagement and voter protection, such things as purging the rolls, a lot of the things that we're starting to see now around gerrymandering, the closing of voting posts, etc. And then the primary issue that got me nominated was working on living wage campaigns. And at that time, I had taken and worked through folks here in New Orleans to raise minimum wage by $1 an hour above the federal. And that was back, I think the minimum wage was $5.75 or something like that. And then because of that work, folks in Florida and other states, I think Ohio, moved on living wage campaigns, and that kind of spurred President Clinton and others to begin to move in the direction of raising wages. And so that work in particular was what I was nominated for And then when the hurricane hit, you know, because of the need at the time, I was seizing. At that time, we did a lot of good work with RFK, particularly right after the hurricane, which hit in, I think it was August, the end of August 2005. By February 2006, we had about 500 people from around the country who had been evacuated from the city of New Orleans, had them come to New Orleans, and in partnership with RFK, held a number of meetings, ended up on the cover of the Washington Post. And George Bush, who was president at the time, I think in December, had said no more money for the Gulf Coast, that the funds that the federal government had put up through a certain grant program would be enough. The week following the 500 people descending upon Washington, D.C., he changed his tune and pledged $19 billion more for the recovery of the Gulf Coast. We also ran a local campaign to save thousands of homes from seizure and demolition, as the city had passed an ordinance that would have allowed them to seize property if people had not come and gutted and boarded their property within the first year of the evacuation process. And that was extremely problematic because most of the people in New Orleans, particularly among low and moderate income families, did not have a way to come home and check on their property, let alone to know the state of it or to worry about gutting and or you know, boarding it up. Nonetheless, we stopped that in its tracks and, you know, just continued to do a lot of good work and had begun working on some federal policy whereby I think it was something like, well, I don't remember, I think $60 billion or something like that. It had been more than that now I'm thinking about it, to create 100,000 jobs across the Gulf Coast to rebuild the Gulf Coast following Hurricane Katrina. And it was based heavily on the New Deal. And in 2010, just to give you an idea of how long we were working on that, in 2010, just as we had come back from DC, we'd gotten the state of Louisiana. We'd started working on some small places in Mississippi. I think we'd gotten Gulfport, and we were deciding what was going to be the second place in Mississippi we were going to target for support, and then Alabama after that. And that was when the Deepwater Horizon, exploded, caught on fire, and fell into the Gulf of Mexico, killing, I think, 11 people who were on the rig, spewing, hundreds, if not thousands of gallons of crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico. And so following that, and a tour with some of the folks from RFK, we developed a program that became known as the Gulf Region Health Outreach Program, providing $105 million to the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida to increase access to health care through the federally qualified health center programs across the Gulf Coast of the 4 states I just mentioned. It impacted some 80 health centers, increased the access and efficiency of those health centers with some $60 million going directly into those, training 4 cohorts of community health workers, and a number of other programs around mental and behavioral health and things like that, just coming out of the BP settlement. And so, it's an ongoing process. I think one of the things that people don't realize about the work of organizing or justice from this particular angle is that it is an ongoing process. There is no final win, there is no final victory. There's always a work to be done, because wherever there's a system whereby you have haves and have-nots, there will always be those who will fight on behalf of the have-nots. And so with that, I'll go ahead and open up and we'll let it roll.
Okay.
Wait, were those 4 questions for me?
No, the questions in the
Okay.
chat are for the students that we would like students to respond to. And if you have questions for Stephen, put them in the chat. And Susan, you have questions that came in through the registration.
Yeah, so thank you for speaking brief, Stephen. A few questions that came in from the registration were firstly, what inspired you to become a community organizer?
Certainly. For me, let me just say that I got into the work simply because I answered an ad in the newspaper and I was looking for work. There's no major story from that angle, right? There was no single incident that resulted in me becoming the way that I am. It's part and parcel of how I was raised, right? I grew up in a neighborhood that was very community oriented. When the parents would have a block club meeting, they would meet with all the kids the next day to explain what had gone on in the meeting. Our block would take trips to plays and things like that as a group. So there was that piece. And one of the things I'd always kind of wanted to do was, this whole idea of how do you help people. So initially I wanted to be a doctor because I know I could help people and make a lot of money. So I thought anyway. I then, while I was pursuing that, so I graduated in biology, but along the way, my mother suggested I take some education courses because back then, teaching was a good job that you could always get. It's not so much the case anymore. But nonetheless, I got into education and really enjoyed it and realized that I could help more people through that. And it was during one of the breaks, I think it was a winter break or something like that. I answered the ad to make a little bit of cash uh, as a community organizer and realized that I could help a lot more people working in this fashion. And what was intended to be, sort of a little temporary job over a vacation turned into a career. And so that's how I ended up in the work.
Thank you, Stephen. Another question from the registration was, did your experience after Hurricane Katrina change how you thought about social change?
Not necessarily. I will say that coming out of Katrina, I certainly had you have to understand, working for Acorn as I did, and I was maybe up at that time about 7, 8 years, I'd already had to deal with local, state, and federal officials around a number of issues and recognized that it was not just a matter of dealing with policy, but that there were also people who benefited from the hardships of the folks that I worked with. And so when Katrina happened, I was under no illusion as to what was going to happen. Um, Let me see, if the hurricane hit on August the 29th, by September the 5th, I think, no, September the 8th. September the 8th, there was already an article in the Wall Street Journal speaking about a group of, what they called the elite of New Orleans who held a meeting in Dallas in order to discuss the future of the city. And coming out of that, there was a gentleman who was quoted as saying that the city would have to change economically, politically, and demographically. And so that was sort of the line in the sand, right? Because New Orleans prior to the hurricane was predominantly African American, over 60%. It was predominantly, it still is somewhat the blue dot in the red state. And economically, it was low income. And so it was very clear that there were things being put in place to change that dynamic. And so up until the quarantine that we're now experiencing, there was definitely work headed in that direction, whether it was the privatizing of the school system by moving it over to a all school choice system, or access to food by the placement of grocery stores and things like that, as well as the increase in the cost of housing, mostly related to Airbnb and things like that, pushing out low-income families and changing the dynamics of the city. So I can't say that Katrina in and of itself changed the way I saw things, other than help to make it a little bit more crystal clear.
Thank you. The final question we have from the registration is, what was the biggest lesson learned from your work post-Katrina?
This is interesting because it plays into what the focus is now. And that is, following Katrina, a lot of the work on the Gulf Coast centered around how do we get things back to the way they were. And the lesson learned is that there's no such thing as going back to the way that things were. And so at this particular point, as we look at the changes that are coming about because of the quarantine related to COVID-19, the focus rather is how do we build a new way, right? What is it that we see for ourselves as the way going forward? How is it different from what exists now, and what do we need to do in order to make that happen? Trying to go back is an effort in futility. Things are changed, and things are going to continue to change. And the direction that that change happens can be influenced.
Thank you. I'll hand it back over to you, Karen.
Yeah. So, hi, I'm Karen Robinson. I work with the Speak Truth to Power program, and we want to open up now for questions that folks have. And I would like to start with one, Stephen. In light of what you just said, this idea of not going back to normal because we need something different. What role do you see young people playing in that, and what advice do you have to the students on this call and to their teachers on how to really do that in a way that brings about this sustainable change that I think many are looking for?
Certainly. Number one, I think probably the most important thing is to realize that there are other ways, that the way that we've been living is not, should not be acceptable. If you consider the fact that prior to, and not just prior to COVID-19, even prior to the current administration, we lived in a world that had accepted the fact that public shootings, mass murders were acceptable, whether they were at concerts, at the movie theater, or within our school system. We had accepted the fact that homelessness, amid a plethora of vacant housing, is acceptable. That GoFundMe could become the primary insurance agency for people who fall sick or need to be buried was acceptable, and none of those things in reality should be acceptable. And that not only are there other models in the world as it exists today, but historically, and that it does well to explore, to read, and to find out what some of those other opportunities for ways of living are, and decide for you which ones work best, that seem to make sure that no one is left behind, as it were. One of the things I think has become very apparent is that our economic system has created a way that right now is it's showing its faults, in that so many people are living a poverty lifestyle, right? I like to say people are comfortably poor, but the reality is that over half of Americans' households were earning less than $50,000 a year, and quite honestly, that's criminal in the richest country in the world. And without getting into all of the different ways that impacts people, just know that there are other ways that we can provide for and care for and make sure that things turn out better for everyone. If there's one thing I'd like for people to think about in terms of how do you make a new way, just consider the fact that the technology that we're using right now is phenomenal. It is astounding. And it was developed within a system that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, berates, beats, and tears everyone down. Everyone is made to feel bad about who they are. Either you are too tall or you're too short, either you're too fat or you're too skinny, either you're too dark or you're too light. Every single one of us is told every single day that we are not worthy. And the fact of the matter is, imagine what the world would be if, instead of telling us how bad we all are and how deficient we all are, if we focused on working toward the best in each and every one of us. And that's something that can occur whether the government or schools or whatever wants to happen. That's something that each individual can take upon themselves as we engage with other people.
Stephen, thank you for that. My name is Adnan Karim. I get the privilege of being the managing director of Human Rights Ed here at RFK Human Rights. So thank you for that piece of advice. As a former educator myself, I definitely appreciate that words of wisdom for all of us here. I also want to highlight, we have one of our lead educators on the line, Christopher Buckley, who teaches out in Connecticut. He has a question for you. Chris.
Hey, Stephen. How you doing, man?
I'm good. I'm good.
It's good to see you. Hey, I have a lot of students on here today, and they're from either my government class, and then I have a number of students from my American history class, and we're looking at two different things, and I was wondering if you might be able to talk about, particularly for my government kids, about what you see as their, people's civic responsibility to organize and participate, and how you view kind of the average citizen's responsibility when it comes to their role in government or in society. And then as a follow-up question, my American kids are going to start looking at the civil rights movement starting in a week or so. And so much of that is based in community organizing. And, at his heart, that's what MLK was. And, John Lewis they were community organizers. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges or some of the things that you found to be inspiring when you come to that idea of organizing.
Sure. Let me just say, man, you have gone quite woolly.
Listen, man, until they free us from this, I'm not shaving.
Yeah, I see. All right. So, I mean, here's the thing. So there are, this is an interesting piece around government, because there's a lot about our system of governance that is under the microscope right now, and that the way that we function is not necessarily the way that it's presented. If we look at the way the American government is presented, then one has to accept the fact that we live in a participatory government, and those who participate get to help make the rules, and those who win typically make rules that make life better for them and folks who are most like them. And there are two schools around how to win in the system that we have. The left, as it were, tends to view the way to win as registering more people to their side so that they can get more votes and win that way. The right has opted for a mechanism that is certainly less expensive and appears to be more successful, and that is focus on denying the opposition the right to have a vote. And so by dissuading and cutting off avenues to participate through the electoral process, they assure their victory. And I think that credence is given to this by the fact that the current president said, if they opened up, if they made it easier for people to vote, a Republican might not ever get voted in office again. And that's because a lot of the things that people want tend to be represented by those who say they're on the left. And so in that regard, it is in all of our best interest to make sure that as many people are participating in the process as possible at all levels of it, whether it be the dog catcher, the city council person, all the way up and including the President of the United States. So that's the piece around governance and how people can play a role in it. It is about making sure that everyone has the opportunity, and whatever way that means, whether you're going around registering people to vote or just getting the word out to people that they need to do so. As far as organizing, I think one of the things that people should know about the civil rights movement is that the civil rights movement did not start as a civil rights movement. It started as a human rights movement and got lessened to civil rights. And it's quite problematic because civil rights then is easily thrown into the quagmire of federal versus states' rights. And whereas human rights, we're looking at what is it that you deserve simply because you exist on the planet Earth. And so I would say in organizing, I think the single thing to keep in mind is that it is not about, the mass marches and things like that. It is actually about changing individuals and moving people from where they're sitting in front of their computers and fussing, screaming, and getting upset to actually taking action. That is the work of an organizer, to move people from being sedentary to taking action on whatever their issue is. And if you can be successful in doing that, then we can change the world.
So I put in the chat to see if anyone has any questions for Stephen. As we get some rolling in, I have a very simple question for you. As you continue your work in social justice and in the focus areas that you're working in, what is the thing that keeps you up at night now? Like, what's that one thing that you just can't not think about? What's that thing that keeps you up?
I sleep well, my friend. No, I don't sit up worrying. I will say though that I am constantly and consistently thinking, pondering, and meditating upon how do we create the new world? What is the domino that needs to be toppled in order to create the change that we're all working for? And so, in that light, that's what occupies a lot of my thought space.
Any questions in the chat?
Y'all are really quiet. You better come up with some questions. Stephen, I have a question for you. You mentioned when you were talking about kind of the where we go from here, based on your experience from Katrina and now this pandemic and quarantine, you'd mentioned that there are other examples out there that might be worthwhile for us to look at. Can you share some of those and kind of an idea of what the trajectory to get there would look like, both from an organizer perspective, but also we have teachers on the call, we have students on the call. Like, I know we've kind of been talking all around this, and it's what we really want to walk away with though from this, right? How do we promote, protect, and defend human rights as we move to this new, whatever it is?
All right. So I think it's fair for me to go ahead and mention that I don't, as I approach my work, my way of thinking about things, I don't approach it from the idea of human rights, right? I really try to think about what is going to make a world that's better for everyone. And when we look at, even here, let's start with capitalism, right? We practice what is known as free market capitalism, but there are other forms of capitalism. We have the whole thing about social democracy that everybody jumped on Bernie about, which was not a foreign idea in these United States. And let me also just say, at this point, I'm not advocating for any particular system, but I am answering the question in terms of what is out there. There's the idea of the social democracy. At one point in time, communism was very strong in the United States, and the reason that it has been cast in the light that it has is because the United States decided that capitalism was going to be the way that it went, and that communism would represent the exact opposite of that. It was basically an economics decision, which unfortunately does not work for the better of everyone. That's not to say that communism is the better system, but I do think that there are opportunities somewhere in between. There are various sorts of governance among smaller groups of people, whether they be, tribes across the United States, or the Americas in general, or even, Africa, or even, the Chinese systems or whatever. But people need to look so they can open their minds and be aware. And the reality may be none of them may be what we need moving forward. But if we don't know what they are, then we're forced to have to deal with the little bit that we know and feel that that's all that can happen. I have a lot of people, who I engage with on Facebook who, their whole thing is that this system has to be, because without the system that we're in, we would all like fall back and live in caves and have to hunt wild animals, and that's just not the case. We can design the world to be what we want it to be. And I think we shouldn't allow ourselves to be held captive by folks who would rather hoard more money than they or their family will ever be able to spend, regardless of how many lifetimes there are, while there are, millions of people who have to go without.
Thank you, Stephen. And I just want to make a plug now, because you just segued into our speaker next week. His name is Derek Hamilton. He was just appointed to the Biden-Sanders Economic Task Force. He was Bernie Sanders' economic advisor. So if you're interested in that piece of it, that's next week. But right now I want to shoot over to Abby, who has a question for you. And I also just want to call out Abby. She'll be one of the students running our final session. So Abby, to you.
Hi, I just had a question, which is, what motivates you to keep going when your work is hard?
So it's not a motivation, it's who I am. This is my purpose. I don't have to think about it, just as professional athletes, all they know. The thing is, once you artists, of varying types, but once you've identified what it is that you're supposed to do, what your purpose is, there's not a need for motivation. It's just what I do. Even if I'm not doing it, it's the way that I think about things. And it permeates everything that I do, such that for me, it's not a matter of having to remember, to give credit to women. It's part of what I do. It's just the way that I've been trained. It's not a matter of, I don't get tired of it. I can do it in my sleep. I often joke that you can wake me out of a drunken stupor and I'll tell you how to run your campaign, because it's just that way. In the same way that when you hear poets or writers talk about, they can't stop it. It just comes through. It's all that they might want to do something else, but the poetry, the songs, the art just pours out of them. In the very same way for me, organizing is what I do. Working with people, trying to build a better way is what I realize that I'm here to do. And so I do that.
Thank you, Stephen. We have another question from one of our other lead educators, Pam, if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
I believe I know this young lady too.
Hi, how you doing, Stephen? It's great to see you.
It's good to see you too.
I'm writing down notes while you're talking, and one of the things that stood out to me, I think, as other people, is you're saying that we can't go back to the way we were, and this is all new territory for all of us, and we have to build a new way of going forward. So my question is, what are some creative ways that students can be engaged in their community while following social distancing protocols?
What are some creative ways? I think you're asking the wrong person. Most creative people on the planet are of the younger set. I think as long as you look around and identify ways that you can do things to accomplish what you will outside of the norm are the creative ways. For instance, one of the things that's been happening on Instagram is the two producers, Swiss Beats and Timbaland, started this thing called Versus, where they get major, started with producers, and I think just last week was Jill Scott and Erykah Badu. Some 775,000 people participated in that. You had DJ D Nice, who's been throwing parties and started off, and now you have others doing the same, as a way for people to come together and enjoy music together, even though they're quarantined. I think that's just the beginning of what the opportunities are. And in as much as we continue to try to think out the box how to accomplish what we want, we'll create new ways. And the thing about creating these new ways is that those who are trying to force us back into what was have no way of stopping that. It can't be stopped.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now the questions are rolling in, rolling in. So I want to first go to Solomon, our brother from South Africa. Yes, we're with you, my friend, and he's interested in learning how to study more about human rights while in lockdown. Just a little shout out, my husband's South African, so all the best to you in Pretoria. So his question is, how do you continue to study while in lockdown? And then we're going to jump to Matthew Eisen after Solomon.
Well, I mean, you know, the internet is rife with information. And there are, you know, I mean, I don't know life in South Africa at this particular time. In the U.S., certainly one can order books that you know, if that sort of thing is available, I would suggest that. But once again, there's a lot on the internet that's available, and there are a lot of people who are having these discussions in various ways. And so I'd advise you to look at that. And then also, I mean, for me, I have a fairly large library relative to the average person, I guess, that, you know, that's seen that big to me. And I'm going back and looking over some of the things that I have in the past, and recognize that. So for me, it's more about the work than the ideology. And so I have found certain books like The Art of War, Sun Tzu, or Klaus von Clausewitz on war to be very helpful as I think about how to engage those folks who would force us back into that old model. But then there are also opportunities to change how you look at things. For instance, there's a Chinese epic, is a classic, is The Three Kingdoms, which covers a very long period of time and looks at some of the types of questions that we're dealing with now. And in those ways, even though the book is not specifically about human rights, it does help you to think about how you can be creative, what are the long-term effects, and how you should be thinking about things. One of the biggest problems we have with our system is everything is about right now, which is why people are, and appearances goes back to the whole thing about tearing people down. When you wonder why people want to run out and get their hair cut.
Oh.
The matter is that the reason people are running out to beauty shops and to the gyms, if you look at the places that they open, they all have to do with narcissism and our desire to fit a mold that we don't. And in as much as we can begin to look at those things that help us think differently, think about what really is important, I think we'll be in a lot better space. I just saw a thing today where they're re-releasing, it's like an African-centered jazz thing that was out big in this African spiritual jazz or something like that. It was really big in the 70s, sort of between the jazz period and the disco period, where music had a very positive message to it. And one of the things was that it was part of the whole Black is Beautiful movement, whereby people went more into the natural hair and those types of things. I think that's coming back, and the quarantine is helping with that. And so the more we begin to embrace who we are in the way that we were born and created to look, the better I think we'll all be. Because once we can let go of worrying about our appearance, we can begin to look at the world that we live in and what can we do to make it a more wonderful thing. I will say I have enjoyed seeing families walk together, which I know was not happening a lot before COVID-19. I think that's really a remarkable thing. The fact that people are cooking more food at home means that people are moving into a healthier lifestyle. One of the side effects of a healthier lifestyle is it frees up your thinking, and you begin to think more and more creatively. So these are unintended impacts, and I think it's also why they're trying to rush us back to work. So that we don't get caught up in that, because the longer this goes on, the less likely it is that we'll return to what was.
Excellent. Thank you, Stephen. So we have Matthew, Jacob, Connor, Marcia, Christine. All right, so I'm going to throw it to Matthew.
Really quickly, Matthew here. Thank you, Stephen, for sharing. Originally from Cincinnati, working in Mexico, and just curious, what music are you listening to? When you start feeling down and can you mention a couple songs to recommend?
Goodness gracious. It's the time. So one of the things you have to realize is Jazz Fest period just left. So we listen to a lot of live music via WWOZ, a local jazz station. You can find it online. And they were playing live sets from Jazz Fest from their archives. And that was pretty phenomenal. Tony Allen just passed, and so I've been listening to a lot of Afrobeat because he certainly brought that back up. Yesterday was Stevie Wonder's birthday, so we have that. I listen to, it's a lot of what I would probably listen to anyway. I listen to a lot of MF Doom, so it's kind of all over the map. I think one thing I don't listen to, and this is not because of COVID-19, but I just couldn't take it over the years. I don't listen to music that is sad or melancholy. I don't find that to be beneficial to my spirit personally. I get caught up in that energy, and it doesn't work for me. So I tend to listen to things that are going to be more uplifting and that help me to focus on what I'm doing. And I would recommend that to anyone. I don't think it's necessarily what music am I listening to, but what are you listening to and how does it make you feel? If you're in Mexico, I know you have access to a lot of really good quality live music that I would advise you to take advantage of. So just my 2 cents. A lot of ballads. They got a lot of ballads. Folks don't know about Mexican ballads.
Excellent. So we're coming down to the last 15 minutes, but let's go to Jacob, Kana, Marcia, and then Christine. Jacob?
Hi, thank you so much for your time, Stephen. So my main question for you was, when you look back on a day of work and you think to yourself, wow, I had a really good, productive, uplifting day of work, what does that look like for you? What's the most rewarding part of the work that you do?
Moving people from sitting in front of the computer to action. That's the most rewarding part of the day. If I know that someone has been frustrated and arguing with their computer screen, I used to say television, but now it's the computer screen or their telephone, to them actually taking action. I think that's the most rewarding thing, because one of the biggest problems we have is inaction. Let me also state something. I meant to mention this earlier in terms of what can people do. There was a study that was done many years ago by the Saguaro Fund that resulted in the book Bowling Alone. We don't much talk about that book anymore. But what the study revealed is that over time, there was a time in the past where people belonged to organizations, and they might be social club, maybe bridge club. People would go to the lodge, whatever it was, but people belonged to organizations. And one of the side effects of them belonging to organizations is that they became more politically active. And the reason is because when you interact with other people, one of the things that you do is you discuss the issues of the day. And the more you discuss the issues of the day, the more involved you become in them. And so one of the things I think that people can and should do is find an organization to belong to. And it really doesn't matter too much. Of course, I'm not going to suggest that you join something that's on the Southern Poverty Law Center's website, for racial hatred or ethnic hatred or anything like that. But belonging to an organization will help you become more politically active. And so that's an important thing. Now,
Awesome.
I was going to say, as regards the question, once again, those days where I know I've moved people to action are incredibly rewarding.
Beautiful. So we have a couple COVID-related questions. I'm gonna, Marcia, will you ask yours?
Who is that?
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Steve. It's me, Marcia. Hi. Okay, my English not that good. I'm from Brazil.
Okay.
Okay. What do you think is the best way to address the issues that in the COVID-19, a lot of people of color is like me, Latino, is dying. So how you think is the best way to address this problem? Because I'm already people are telling me, "Oh, you gotta be careful, you're Latina," and I'm like, I'm in a good health, so why should I? I understand that Latino people and African American people, they are dying more than the white people. So how can we address this better?
Certainly. And the question that you ask is directly related to our economic system, in that the people who we see that are the most impacted are those who have to put themselves in the line of danger for the sake of meeting their basic needs, right? Whether it's paying their rent, their bills, purchasing medicine, purchasing food, all of these different things that we have to pay for. If a person has worked in a low wage situation, they don't have savings. And it's not because they're wasteful. It's because they don't make money to meet all of their ends as is anyway. And so when you have a situation where we're in a pandemic, and let's be absolutely clear about what is occurring, right? This virus will have to hit every single person on the planet before this thing starts. And the reason that we're doing quarantine is so that we don't overrun the healthcare system, right? So that they can treat as many people as they can. Because if we overload the system, then it crumbles and more people die who may have been spared had they had the opportunity to receive adequate health care. So the reason that you see more people of color passing is because more people of color work on the front lines, whether it be at the grocery store, whether it be doing repairs on the streets, or whatever it is. Those jobs that are necessary for people for society to maintain itself, right? Even within the healthcare system, tend to be people of color. And so that's why we're being hit at a higher rate. The only thing I can say, given the way things are, and that we can't just tell people to stop doing what they need to do, is that people should be directed to, as much as possible, practice preventative health. Eat as healthy as you can. Try to get as much exercise, and when and where possible, avoid being out in public and wear your mask. It all sounds rather simplistic, but the thing that we have to recognize is that technology will not save us from the virus.
Thank you, Stephen. You kind of touched on Connor's question was about
That's
this.
it.
Connor, are you gonna? Oh.
So.
Oh, sorry, Stephen. You're cutting out. Sorry.
All right. So, did everyone get the piece about being healthy?
Yeah, and actually, that was a great segue into Connor's question. And Connor, are you keen to ask, or do you want me to ask it?
Can you ask? I'm just a little bit nervous.
Okay, not a problem, not a problem. So his question's a kind of a continuation of that, Stephen. So his question is about healthcare. When you have people who don't have insurance or coverage, they don't go to the doctor. How do you stop? It's about this inequities that you're talking about. How do you stop a pandemic if people don't have access to healthcare? Is universal healthcare ever going to be taken seriously? Do we think that will become a reality? Kind of what are you seeing, and what are your thoughts on that? Did I get it, Connor?
Yes, thank you. It was just about how people don't all have the same access and are now nervous to go to the doctor. So how do we take this seriously? How will this become a reality soon?
So, as relates to healthcare in the United States, let me be absolutely clear on this point, because this one is there's no getting around the fact that what will absolutely be necessary in order for us to move to a situation of universal healthcare, which polls have demonstrated that a significant majority of Americans want, will be nothing short of, a full-scale, push, a revolution. Not that you have to get out there with the guns and knives and pitchforks and all of that, but accept that there is an absolute demand, and that and I hate to say it this way, that we will shut this mother down unless it is granted. The powers that be will continue to find ways to skirt the issue and provide the minimum that they can. And that's because so much money is related to healthcare. And, a lot of people tend to not realize that prior to President Nixon, it was against the law for people to try to profit off of healthcare, and that it was a change in a law that set us on this path. We've not always been this way. And even going into hunger before Reagan, hunger was almost non-existent in the United States. But the laws were changed, and so that people could make that money. Meanwhile, others ended up suffering. And so until we get to the point where, I'm going to help you all to fully appreciate this. It was when Obama was in office. On the stimulus package, right? They asked for a vote from the public. The public voted against it. They pushed it through anyway, right? And it wasn't, and this was led by Pelosi. So it wasn't that Republicans pushed it through. Even around questions around, the Affordable Care Act, there were significant questions that people were asking that were credible questions, but there was the need to push it through because the powers that be wanted it to happen at that time. And so we will continue in this journey of asking for universal health care, and it will continue to be pushed as a leftist idea until such a time as a majority of people force the government to do it. And I don't just mean in terms of calling into your representatives and senators, because they will take the calls and everything else and turn around and vote it down and pocket the money that they receive from the healthcare industry. So it will take a lot. It is nothing short of changing the dynamics of how we're governed in order to change what will happen with healthcare. There are a lot of people who are ready to make that happen, but it should come from. You know what? Let me help you with this. Do you know that the biggest changes that we've seen in modern history, the civil rights era, were led by people who were under the age of 35? Just want to put that out there to folks who are listening, that a lot of the Black Panthers were not yet 21 years old, yet they had a significant impact on the American lifestyle. Some of the things that they put forth, a lot of folks are unaware of, right? School breakfast was not provided, right? Healthcare centers was not a thing, and until the Black Panthers began to run those types of programs, which were later picked up by states and the federal government. Change does not happen from the government down. It happens from the people up. And the people who have created the greatest change in these United States of America have been people who are under the age of 35. So I'd like to put that out there for people to think about, particularly students, that many of the folks that you read about in history were not older people. So don't be afraid to do it just because you're young.
Thank you, Stephen. So I'm gonna, we're getting close to the end. We have 2 questions, and I also wanna put on the screen, so don't go away, anyone. Okay. So I'm putting on the screen the questions that we want students to respond to. So I hope you've seen these students and respond to these, because the last session will address those. And then I also just want to make sure people go to the site, and these are the sessions coming up over the next few weeks. But while you're looking at this, I'm going to go, Stephen, if you have time for 2 more questions, would that be okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so we have Christine and Jessica, please. Christine first. You still with us? I know folks are going to have to skip off now, so. Jessica?
I'm driving right now. Can you read the question for him?
Oh, okay. I have the motive. Well, could another STTP team read the question? I can't get it.
Let me make it short and simple. I'm a social work student. I love human rights, and in his career, how can he incorporate social work into his job or advocacy that he's doing, and how he sees a change now with the COVID-19 and all the issues that are going on with the career of social work, and also like how can we advocate to have society value social work more, because it's like a systemic issue, because more women are social workers, they get paid less, and it's the whole system. So how can we make society value social work more? Thank you.
That's a tough question because it's related to a particular career path that frankly I'm not very familiar with. I'm familiar with social work in a very general sense. But the work, but social work is not the same as organizing. The closest it gets is in the role of advocacy. And even then, it can be an interesting thing to play. I think that the field of social work, and I've noticed among certain groups of African American social workers who've looked to make African and African American culture a greater part of the work that they do, and to try to focus on not promoting policies that might be harmful to the people who they work with. I think a great example of what I'm speaking of in terms of the way that social work can inadvertently create problems is in the movie Claudine. I would advise everyone to go watch it if you haven't seen it. It is an old movie, don't let there be any doubt about that. But one of the things about the movie Claudine was that the mother was on welfare, and she started dating a guy. But he could never be at the house if the social worker came by, because that could result in the mother losing her welfare benefits. And while that was an old movie, and while that may seem like an antiquated notion, I would like to point out that the federal government's Hope 6 program for housing, which was supposed to make more mixed income housing, had as one of its rules that families who were going to be moving into public housing could not have anyone who had a felony record or a record of addiction. And so there were cases where families had to decide whether or not they were going to take the housing, which would mean that the father would have to separate himself from his family, or would they forego the housing and try to see what they could do? And no one should have to be put in that situation. And so when I think about social work and what social workers can do, it is really about looking at what is occurring and how can you avoid putting people into those types of situations, and fighting against a system that would create such a system where people have to decide whether to split the family up or keep the family together. Within the system of COVID-19, when we look at the fact that the federal government has moved to saying that if someone has had COVID-19, that they cannot join the military, once again creates a very interesting dynamic, and it's something that should be looked at, because when we move to a situation where in the short run, people will be discriminated against because they may have been exposed to or fallen ill from COVID-19 and recovered, and will that be used as a way to further marginalize, as the sister from Brazil pointed out, African American and Hispanic communities? And I think we should go ahead and include Asian in that as well, who've already seen tremendous spike in attacks on their community because of the language of the administration. So that's where I am on social.
All right, so we have one last question to close it out, but I do want to give a shout out to our social work partners, because I think, Stephen, if you saw the description of the SUNY Stony Brook School of Social Welfare, you would be pretty impressed, and Jessica is a pretty outstanding activist. So, but I think it's important to know kind of the history as well. So to our last question, Christine.
I think she put in the chat that she wants us to read it.
Oh, but I said yes, but I would like to read it.
Oh, okay, I see that. Oh, but I would like it read.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So I think this is a really good one to end on. How do you combat complacency in the masses? Unless a problem affects somebody directly, too often they don't seem to really care. So what are some of your tips or strategies for combating complacency?
So first, drop the idea that people are complacent or apathetic. Usually people just lack information. So in organizing, you meet people where they are, right? You have to deal with whatever the issue is that is important to them. You cannot project issues onto people. So for instance, when I used to train people on door-to-door organizing, you ask someone, what issue would you like to see change to make your community better, or whatever that question is. You wait to hear what it is that they're going to say, right? So even if, and this is actually what I would say, even if there's a giant hole in the middle of the street that goes down to the depths of hell, and there are demons flying in and out of it with pitchforks and bat wings and everything else, and fires leaping out, you do not mention that. You ask, what is your issue? And if they say their issue is that the lady next door has cats that won't be quiet, then you work with her on the cats that won't be quiet, because that's what her issue is. And as you work with her on her issue, then she will become open to working on other issues. I've run across many times people say, well, Steve, how is it that you're able to get community people to come out to these meetings? And I have to remind people, I've worked with them in their neighborhoods on issues that concern them directly. And it's not that these other issues don't concern them, they certainly do. However, a citywide or a statewide or even a federal issue can seem overwhelming to a person who has yet to see any action taken on cutting down the overgrown lot across the street. And so you have to work with people where they are on what it is that they would like to see made better. And then you continue to work with them. And along the way, you help them to see that it's not individual issues that are causing their problems, but that there's a system in place that creates these inadequacies, and that they need to join into the fight, as it were, in order to remove those inequities. And that's what the work is all about.
Mic drop. Thank you, Stephen. That's awesome. That is awesome. So we are over time. Stephen, I want to thank you so much for joining us for our very first Defender Speaker Series event. I think that your experience, your knowledge, your insight is incredibly valuable. And even if we just walk away and say, meet people where they are.
I don't know what you said, but I agree.
Can you not hear me? Just meeting people where they are and going from there. And we've got a lot of work ahead of us. So thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Hopefully we see you next week. Feel free to reach out to the Speak Truth to Power team if you need anything more. STTP@rfkhumanrights.org. If you have more questions for Stephen, let us know. We can try to connect as best as possible. And again, Stephen, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Stay blessed.
Love you, my friend.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Everyone.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Jenny.